Welcome to the Empty World podcast. I'm Gabriel Bonamy, and today I get the opportunity to talk with Jason Barahona Rosales. Jason is the program coordinator at the US Degrowth Institute. He works on highlighting the pre-existing work directly and indirectly related to the degrowth movement and empowering others to challenge the paradigm of economic growth. These challenges happen in community events, university dialogues, and other engagements that seek to form new combinations of solidarity in order to achieve social and ecological justice. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Jason, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Our listeners will know you from the introduction as the programs coordinator for the Degrowth Institute based in Chicago. As we get started here, I'd love for you to tell us a bit about your own journey. I know that degrowth wasn't your initial focus. Could you walk us through the path that brought you to advocacy?
Yeah, I think you'll be hard pressed to find anyone who maybe started in the degrowth space. As I've met so many different people, it's been very nice to hear that everyone has had sort of this winding road to this discipline, if you want to call it this movement of movements as it's been called in the past. For me, it was just as indirect as maybe some other people I know. You could say that my involvement could have started with my interest in social justice. That maybe comes from even personal experience, being an immigrant in the United States from Honduras. That experience has been one that is ever present in my life. But then also, not everyone who's an immigrant is sort of all of a sudden impassioned to be involved in politics and that sort of thing. But for me, it just sort of always piqued my interest. Had a great opportunity at the end of my high school time, so right before I entered college, to be elected to my local city council. And that really was my first sort of involvement with local organizing, local governance, and more importantly, seeing how ordinary people can really end up being the decision makers, and learning how to appeal to people in sort of governance does become a endeavor of appealing to people that you know on the street. And to persuade people isn't just about being the best maybe person who can argue or maybe debate, but also can you fill a room with people who are interested in a legislative order? Can you get people to bother their elected leaders so then they think that their constituents care about a certain thing? But yeah, and then on top of that, to build a sidewalk in a city, that doesn't just go down to a local council member, but also you need to talk to the state and even potentially federal organizations. And again, this was interesting just to learn that an 18-year-old can just kind of knock on a door and the person's like, "Oh, someone cares about this. Let's get on it." It's not always that easy, obviously, but some things can be a little bit simpler than maybe we might initially think. But to not dwell too much on pre-university times, you would maybe expect me to say that then I went to university to study, law or politics. No, I chose to do biological engineering at Purdue University. My focus was mainly in cells and viruses. But being at Purdue, there's a big emphasis on also food and agriculture. So that really kind of opened up my world to being able to see how things are made from farm to then to the table. And of course, all the engineering processes that go into that, from thermodynamics and all these other great terms that have to do with biological systems and energy. This was maybe the most interesting thing to me when I'm still kind of in the back of my mind thinking about justice and sort of, I'm not only thinking about the farms from a perspective of this is where we get our food, but also who are the people who are working in these farms? Who are the people who are tending to be it the animals or the crops? Because at the end of the day, it's still people, even though machinery is a big part of how, especially in the industrialized world, how we sort of do farming. There is still a lot of hands that need to be involved in this. So again, it's this something is kind of buzzing in my mind and I don't really know what to do about it at this point. Still, it's something I can't really put away. Of course, as the years go by, I picked up a minor. I picked up political science just to kind of continue staying involved in that. I worked at a public library, and we try to unionize that. So trying to be involved in this sort of like justice angle. But my time at university was that there was a professor, Dr. John Mulrow, who was the director here at Degrowth Institute. At the time, he was a visiting professor at Purdue University, and he was holding these monthly degrowth conversations. So I think when I first heard about it, we were reading Jason Hickel's Less is More, which I think has been a lot of people's introduction to degrowth. But what was most interesting about those conversations was not so much the book itself, but the style of conversations that were being had there, where it was a professor inviting his students to sort of come to some sort of conclusion about what to do with this idea of a planet that has biophysical limits, one that we've surpassed those biophysical limits, and then what is the solution to that. And it wasn't someone sort of handing down expertise. It was someone who was really asking, I kind of need help with how to develop this. Of course, John has his points of expertise, but anyway, it very much attracted me to the group. And what I wanted to do to challenge the group was we had a lot of engineers. We had a lot of people who were looking at this from a very STEM oriented background. And what we ended up having was that we all agreed that yes, it seems like we've overshot the planetary boundaries. We would say that the real economy has gone way beyond with what the planet can sustain, and that you can tie that to carbon emissions keep going up, despite this claim that the GDP has been delinked from carbon, and also other parts of biophysical capacities are also sort of being harmed. For example, biodiversity or nitrogen levels in our oceans. So we come to this conclusion that yes, we agree on all this stuff, but then it's like, what do we do now? We're academics essentially sitting in a university, and what exactly needs to happen from either an activist standpoint or even just from a university standpoint of like, how do you get a university like Purdue to care about something like this? So then this is where sort of maybe this justice angle really came to me, and where I really felt like we should focus in on the writings of past civil rights leaders in the United States, because they've been looking at a very similar question. How do you overcome these odds that seem insurmountable? But of course, if you decide to do nothing, that's chaos. That's a complete, basically hell world for you and your community. Of course, at the time, I had recently read Martin Luther King's final book before he was assassinated, called Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. I felt like that answered a lot of the questions that kept coming up in this group. And I think that really set a new tone for what that degrowth colloquium really was focused on. And then this really led to an opportunity to branch out to some other groups on campus, not just in STEM, but also those who were thinking about this from a democratic socialist perspective, those who were thinking about this from a feminist perspective, those who were thinking about it even just from the standard sustainability angle, and everything that has to do with that, and some other folks in the standard like political science or econ. And then we had a much more diverse group, a group that was really trying to answer these questions, again, still with each other, from people of different levels, from undergrad, grad, faculty, and staff. So we even had, I think, one of the sustainability managers of Purdue University coming to these talks, all kind of understanding that it can't just be one discipline or one professor who's sort of sharing how to do this. It will kind of take people from different backgrounds, different disciplines, different ideas to get to this idea of what it means to live within planetary limits. And so this is how degrowth really was cemented in my mind.
This is fascinating. What I'm getting from all that you're sharing is a specific attachment to enhancing democratic decision making, whatever it is that you're focusing on. I really appreciate you mentioning the social justice focus and this meandering process towards getting to the degrowth conversation. And then within that conversation, noticing that perhaps the conversation has to be expanded beyond the participants of the seminar that you mentioned. I want to prod you a little bit on that point. What was your role in the seminar? How did you feel going through this conversation series? I mean, getting presented with these degrowth topics, but also, as I understand, taking on the responsibility of expanding those conversations beyond the initial group.
Maybe this is a personal attitude that I have, but it did worry me that I'm coming to this group and I'm just immediately off the bat agreeing with everything that's being said. And like I was mentioning earlier, every conversation did sort of end with, we agree with each other, but now what? It was always this sort of like, so what, now what? And in that first semester that I participated, it was a lot of, yes, there were arguments on the how we get to certain points, like what is the underlying cause of the paradigm of endless economic growth. some people might say directly say capitalism. Some people might say it has something to do with the U.S. and its position post World War II. But then this is kind of getting just into like maybe bogged down into details, and maybe some people know about certain things more than others, and so it's maybe minor disagreements. But the overall effect, like I was saying earlier, is that the outcome is we agree that we've gone beyond biophysical limits, but we don't know exactly what to do with that information. And because I'm now showing up monthly and I'm excited about these talks, I'm like, okay, it's great that we have a lot of emerging experts, right? Because again, it's still a lot of undergrads and mainly grad students. And every now and then we'd have a professor show up as well. So you have these people who are really willing to work on the hard science part of it. But it's still like a very tense, like frustrating, like, okay, what's going to happen from here? And for me, right, at the time, I'm an undergrad. So I'm thinking to myself, surely there are other people who have thought about this. I can't be the only one. I'm not a unique person who's just now seeing this. So in my mind, I'm like, let's go and find as much help as possible on this campus. Let's make the most of the fact that we're at a university that I want to say the population is somewhere in the 50,000. So this large land grant university in Indiana, there's an opportunity to reach out to other folks. And throughout my time at Purdue, of course, like if you're interested in any sort of justice, right, you know that there are student groups trying to advocate for something. But then even in these groups, there is also these frustrating points of like, you can only do so much. You have your scope and you find the things that you're good at. For example, if you're a sustainability group, you might find that you might clean up after a football game, for example, and help with recycling and trash pickup. Or if you are the feminist group that I reached out to, they did a really great job of every year they would have this march for women's reproductive rights. And again, it's very specific things that that you can make an impact in, but you also have this feeling of these are single programs that might help build community. But then in terms of impacting change, surely there's a bit more that we could be doing. What I felt was that this degrowth idea, this umbrella, was sort of maybe a blanket to wrap these things together, to be able to build this sort of web, this bridge for these different organizations to see where the connection points could sort of lie. And I had the time to be able to go to these groups. And I would just say, could you give me 5 minutes to talk about degrowth? And they were like, okay, sure. And that was enough to at least pull in maybe 1, 2, 3, sometimes 5 people from those groups and have them show up at the monthly meeting. That helped kind of grow the group. And of course, finally, that led to a larger symposium that we were able to put on that had an economics panel, that had a philosophy panel, and then had a larger multidisciplinary conversation with everybody who was there. And that was, I felt, very successful and created the energy needed then to even spawn the Degrowth Institute later on.
Yeah, it sounds like expanding those conversations kind of revitalized maybe moments when you felt stuck with the so what part of the conversation. Well, once you've covered the scientific basis for planetary boundaries and the fact that the economy has indeed outgrown the planet. I think this is a great segue towards your mission at the Degrowth Institute and especially the Challenge to Growth series that you're working on. For listeners who might not know, this is a series of reports that you're working on to help summarize current thinking on economic growth and maybe pointing out the incoherence with pursuing infinite economic growth on a limited planet. Most recently, you published the What Happens to the Savings report. I know that was the fruit of a lot of work, and I invite anyone listening to go check it out. It's a brilliant piece. How did you land on that central question? And would you mind taking us through what you see as the most salient points in this publication, at least in the thinking process that led to you putting out this great piece of work?
So what happens to the savings, and then its predecessor, Has the Economy Outgrown the Planet, are part of this ongoing series called the Challenge to Growth series. And you'll notice, even if you go through our website at degrowthinstitute.org, you'll notice that the slug is Challenge to Growth 1 and Challenge to Growth 2. And if you look us up on Instagram, it's called Challenge to Growth. That's our handle instead of just Degrowth Institute, because we really want to focus on this idea of being very direct in our languaging. What exactly is it that we're saying when we say degrowth? What exactly is it that we're saying when we talk about has the economy outgrown the planet or what happens to the savings? We're trying to make a challenge to endless economic growth. And we really want to emphasize that. We want there to be no confusion about that. And so through this series, right, we're trying to build these primers that are easily shareable, that take scientific language and maybe make them a bit more approachable, but still maybe geared toward people who work in sustainability or are interested in sustainability, and just ask them to take that next step beyond just thinking about things in terms of maybe, again, kind of like I was talking about earlier about these clubs before, how you have these things that you know that you're good at, but then in terms of actually noticing change and we're reflecting on what does this mean for the grander scheme, taking the opportunity to explore that, to maybe face the abyss and maybe dive in. And so then, Has the Economy Grown the Planet was meant to sort of just open the door and just touch on this idea of this definition of degrowth that we've come to express here at Degrowth Institute, right? That degrowth is an intentional downscaling of the global economy for the purpose of achieving social justice and ecological sustainability, and everything that means from every point of that definition, from the social justice component, from the ecological sustainability component, and the fact that it's intentional. But then it's like, okay, as this series goes on, and we hope to, in the coming year, publish at least 2 more, we want to go into the other thoughts and common questions that come up in the conversations that we've been having over the last year, 2, 3 plus, right? Because these conversations didn't just start when the Degrowth Institute started, but even right before. Spent a lot of time talking about Purdue in this conversation. But we really want to take what we feel is the real work that we do, which is the conversations that we're having, not necessarily just the research or the writing or the admin part, but the conversations that we have, take those and express and share with others what it is that we're learning from them. So a common question that we know comes up is this idea of, you talk about efficiency gains are often lost due to the growth imperative. And so then the question is, okay, what happens to those savings? And people might be familiar with the concept of Jevons paradox. People might be familiar with the rebound effect. But if I start to talk to you about, Jevons, and I talk about rebound effects, there's an audience of people who will get excited and be very eager to discuss. But other people's, and even I could even say, me included, like your brain just turns off, or you might even say like, I've heard this a million different times in a million different ways, and I just want to get to the point of where I'm thinking about, okay, no, what's next? What's the next step with this? So what happens to the savings tries to get the first part out of the way of the savings are respent. The savings are redeployed. Whether we're talking about light bulbs and the efficiency gains with LED lights, going from incandescent to LEDs, or we're talking about cars, and as we move from gas fuel to electric, or paper gains, for example, that email has provided us, where apparently this was news to me as a younger person in Generation Z. Apparently people used to print all their emails, and they no longer do so from this campaign of like save the trees. But those paper gains, right, the internet enabled, also then enabled companies like Amazon to increase sales and therefore packaging use. And so the paper gains are then lost and redeployed elsewhere. So what we really want to emphasize with this primer is not so much that efficiency is bad in and of itself, but more so emphasize that the structure of committing to endless economic growth causes this redeployment of the savings. And this commitment to economic growth is not just a cultural or intellectual feeling. It is directly in the legislation of the largest economies in the world. You can see that from either, like in the United States, from the EPA or from congressional acts or whatever the equivalent is for other countries, they directly outline that there needs to be a commitment to economic growth year on year, for the sake of either the health of the economy or the health of the people. And for whatever the reason that it might be, it's still in service of a growing economy. So of course, if that's the case, we argue that there will always be a sort of tension that exists, a sort of a backdrop to all efficiency claims and all sustainability claims will be that those savings that we gain will be redeployed somewhere else. And although maybe it might not be as carbon intensive, we also need to think about the fact that there are other things that needs to deal with apart from carbon. That might be biodiversity. That might be land use changes. That might be biogeochemical flows. But if we only focus on one part of this balloon that exists, then we might think that that's shrinking, but that would be ignoring the bulging effect that exists elsewhere.
I really like this phrasing that you used, which is the backdrop to all sustainability and efficiency claims is this growth imperative that, as you say, is outlined explicitly in legislation. Something that I also appreciate you mentioning is how people who are familiar with degrowth and with the case for the idea that the economy has outgrown the planet do get tired of hearing about the rebound effect and hearing about how efficiency gains are reinvested. And they do want to get to the so what part of the conversation. What do we do? How can we change things? Just before we get into that, I quickly want to ask you a bit about how your report has been received, if you've gotten any feedback, and whether that's from sustainability professionals or people who are new to degrowth, people who are part of the conversation, have been for a long time. What has the response been like?
The response has been generally positive, at least so far in the now almost a month since we've made it public. Has the economy grown the planet kind of had a more there was some tension in certain groups that we were talking to, and of course the question I think is a bit more provocative, like has the economy grown the planet. If you're already for the ideas of degrowth, I think you're more inclined to say that's an obvious yes. But if not, then then it's a no. The question is a yes or no question. So of course it's two extremes. So it'll cause a little bit more maybe controversy. Whereas what happens to the savings is a lot more ambiguous, and it does mean a conversation has to be had, and you might not necessarily even know what savings we're talking about before you read. So it is a lot more inviting. It does ask you to read, and I think we've done a fairly good job to outline, indeed what does happen to those savings. And we come to the conclusion that they're redeployed due to the imperative on endless economic growth. In terms of maybe certain criticisms that we've received, it's come mainly from people, especially who are also operating within degrowth advocacy. They feel that maybe we don't emphasize enough the reasons, the underlying currents that exist for the growth imperative, and get into maybe sort of the more economic analysis. We really wanted the scope of this brief to be very hyper focused, because the purpose of this is to be able to be shareable with as many people as possible from different backgrounds. And there is a lot of literature out there that does get into the more in-depth reasonings behind the growth imperative. And we try our very best as well in the references section, which is nice and beefy, to refer to the people who have been doing this great work. And that's another thing I really want to emphasize, that with this Challenge to Growth series, we really want it to be not only a great place to sort of read a recap of the concepts that exist within degrowth, but then also an opportunity to then go investigate these claims that we're making. So heavy on the references, and really trying to emphasize too the work that exists within North America, because we're kind of standing on the shoulders of giants from Europe, but there needs to be a bigger push, we feel, on the North American continent to really engage with this conversation from a North American context as well. Because we've talked in the past that degrowth, while macro in scale, will need also localized solutions. So one way to really get at that idea has been this priority on the references to come from, as much as possible, this region of the world.
I'm really glad you mentioned the North American context and how it provides a new space for degrowth advocacy to reinvent itself and to adapt itself to the issues that a North American public would be more receptive to. By now, I have a sense that most of our listeners are aware not only of the argument for degrowth, but also the messaging challenge that it represents. And in that context, I'll mention a Lancet paper that came out last week titled Assessing Public Support for Degrowth. And what they found is that participants in the study who were in the UK and in the US are overwhelmingly supportive of the policies that underpin the degrowth agenda. But the resistance seems to be coming from the degrowth label itself. And so after acknowledging these findings, the authors kind of conclude the paper by saying, quote, "Therefore, negative perceptions of the degrowth label appear surmountable once people learn about the main principles behind degrowth, and fostering proactive engagement with global challenges and awareness of nature's fragility could further enhance the public's acceptance of degrowth." End quote. I find that this paper comes at such an opportune time in the context of the conversations that you guys are having at the Degrowth Institute and the advocacy that you're leading. I'm curious to hear how you take the findings of this report, whether it intersects with conversations you might have had maybe at Purdue or in the engagement that you're doing as part of your role at the Degrowth Institute. that we know the word degrowth can shut down a conversation quite quickly. Just what have you learned from these experiences communicating and figuring out what works and what doesn't?
Degrowth is such a like you mentioned, can be such a provocative term, and it's always very interesting though who responds in what way. And of course, I think the question that I think often needs to be asked, or I hope is being asked, is degrowth for who?
Mm.
But what's been most notable has been that people will often say something like, I agree with everything that you're saying, but what about the people who don't? Not even just with the degrowth term, but just the ideas themselves. They'll say like, I agree that there needs to be a limit on the size of the global economy, and I agree that we've overshot the planetary boundaries. But what about all the people who disagree with you? But I keep kind of asking like, okay, well, where are they? Like, can you show them to me? Because the more you talk about the ideas, kind of like you mentioned, and that this study found, people tend to find them popular.
Mm-hmm.
Or we find that regardless of if we are in a university talking about degrowth, or if we are in a community space talking about degrowth, or most recently we engaged with maybe a larger Chicago community through the Chicago Climate Connect. That's an organization that puts on these sustainability talks about 1 or 2 times a month. It was hosted in a sort of a tech accelerator, so maybe even the opposite of what we would think about where a degrowth conversation would be held, right? An idea of techno optimism is at the center of these places, and that maybe we can innovate our way out of our problems. But even there, the conversation was well received. People found the ideas engaging and interesting. Yes, people get hung up on the word degrowth, but also how much does that matter when they're agreeing with the ideas? So then maybe for us, what that's become is degrowth is a term that is in our organization title. So we're not moving away from that. But it is very context dependent. I may use degrowth in a space that I already know that the sustainability problem has already been identified. People are very relaxed with that term. So I'll use degrowth as a point to maybe challenge notions of what to do about that problem. But then in a place where climate and planetary boundaries aren't really emphasized, then why would I introduce a term that now I'm going to have to define? So that's where challenge to growth, or where has the economy grown the planet, or what happens to the savings. That's when then these kind of tools really come into play. And then, of course, right, North America isn't just the United States and Canada. Mexico and Central America, the Caribbean, they all exist in this space too. Personally, I'm originally from Honduras, and when I'm speaking to either family or colleagues that exist in these spaces, it's not even about degrowth. It's about words like delinking from the growth imperative, or other words that are often expressed like phrases like buen vivir, and right, the idea of having enough. And all this to say, I'm not saying that there isn't backlash or points of tension in any space. All these spaces will always have, regardless of we're talking about geographies or economic strata or different disciplines, there's always people who feel like the idea, the concepts are not founded in reality. They might be thinking about problems on a scale that's too small and too myopic, and that the reality is that we can decouple, and the reality is that we can move forward with this idea of growth if we wait long enough. But the question then becomes, okay, how long can we wait when the issue is happening right now? Because the idea of 2 degrees warming, or whatever these like future projections are made, yes, they project a future world that's a problem for maybe people who are most well off. But the reality of the matter is that, and this is where I come back to the justice thing, people are already feeling the effects today. And so to tell them to wait longer for a solution that is just as projected as maybe what degrowth might be, because right, neither is being implemented right now, then that's to tell people that their reality is not an experience worth considering, because we need to trust that our current system will provide for them.
So, given this tension between degrowth has to happen on a macroeconomic level, but at the microeconomic scale for a whole range of populations, the challenges that degrowth is supposed to help solve are already being lived. So, that's one tension. The other tension is using the word versus adopting a more context specific approach, kind of basing what you say and what you advocate for based on what you might think people respond positively to, or advocating for something that they can grasp and that makes sense to them. How do you navigate the heterogeneity between your work in English speaking United States focusing on degrowth. And then, as you were mentioning, Buen Vivir and translations of degrowth in Spanish. Maybe on a personal level and also in your communication, how does that affect the way that you communicate and advocate, given that what's so beautiful about degrowth advocacy is you can't really tiptoe around the main message. There's a limitation to the amount of reformulation you can do when you're advocating for degrowing the economy.
This experience of coming maybe from the Spanish speaking background, but not having grown up in a country in which Spanish is the predominant language, has been that, I didn't go to school learning Spanish. And much less in university, I wasn't learning about, scientific concepts in Spanish. So that has almost created like a sort of, on one end, maybe a cap on how I can think about these things from a Spanish background. This is not to say that, I can't express myself in that way, but I have to be a lot more creative, and especially when I'm talking to family members about, I'm not gonna say things like biophysical limits or something like that, nor do I need to. The concept of degrowth, the concept of enough. What's very interesting is that these are universal ideas, and they didn't spring from the minds of degrowth researchers. There's a context that we maybe have decided to ignore in industrialized nations, the traditions that existed before colonial effects and that continue to exist today, right? We're talking about indigenous experiences, and then even a little bit more different than maybe we might tend to think, the experiences of the most marginalized. For example, in the United States, the experience of immigrants who maybe don't have the right to vote or don't have access to things that are services and infrastructural capacities that are granted to citizens. They have to find new ways to sort of collaborate with each other and kind of exist and thrive outside of the legal boundaries to ensure that they still can live a dignified life. This is something that I was able to like, I had the good fortune to be able to be participating in and be exposed to at a young age. And in that, I was able sort of to learn how to tap into already this idea of creative thinking and participating in structures that are already outside of the orthodox systems. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's the most maybe radical thing to say, that there are a lot of people in the United States, in Latin America, across the world, who have more than enough tools ready to thrive in a smaller economic system. But the tension is that the vast majority, especially in the States, do rely on an economic growth, a system of economic growth. Right? If we talk about like retirement funds, pensions, the way that our stock market is also intertwined with general monetary value, these are things that certain communities don't even have access to, so they're not even thinking about them. But again, what does this mean for people who are fully tapped into this system? So there's an opportunity to exchange ideas. There's an opportunity to sort of find ways in which we can start to ratchet down these systems and protect each other in the meantime. But these are the spaces where I think these ideas start to become somewhat dangerous, because they are looking at the reality. They are looking at trying to take these leaps, trying to engage in some real action. Whereas maybe in the past, we've decided to stay within the safe zone of what we have already known, to not necessarily work in the past, but to cause the slowest course to collision, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, on this point of moving towards the doing of degrowth and towards a more normative stance of we've acknowledged the issue, what can we do about it now? One thing that excites me about this conversation, and I was really looking forward to prior to starting this, was that with rather at similar stages in figuring out our place in this movement, and especially when it comes to not speaking from positions of established authority. I mean, we have university degrees, but at least in my case, that's the most that I can really say about the hill from which I'm speaking. How do you sit with the uncertainty of what doing degrowth looks like while still advocating for something quite strongly?
Something that happened for now for me is 7 years ago, but a high school experience. But that city council involvement, like I was mentioning before, that provided me with maybe the first notion of, yes, there are people who have more experience than you. and they have been maybe in the game for decades at the time of when I came in, and I'm fresh on this. At that time I had no university degrees, no high school degrees. I had nothing to my name except for maybe 17 years. But that didn't mean that I had to take a back seat and just kind of defer to them. I already understood that I disagreed with some of the things that my colleagues were saying. I already knew that I had certain opinions that didn't align with everybody, and that was going to happen no matter what because they didn't agree with each other. It would be a lot more daunting if everyone in the room felt exactly the same way about everything, and then I'm the one who's kind of saying something different. But it's sort of inviting that, okay, well, there is already sort of tension points here, and I can just find where I fall within that. So that experience, I've tried to really hold on to it, not for its own sake, but for the learning experience that it was to, as I move, whether that be back in university, and I was trying to take it upon myself to connect to other student groups and even to professors. But now, sitting in this, like, only a couple of years out of college and figuring out how to engage the best in this Negro space, where there are people who have 30 years of literature writing, who are experts that I'm excited to work with or to learn from, because I need that sort of backbone. I need that sort of, they've laid down the path that I can walk on, but then there's still this large, like, road that's not been traveled. This kind of mess and jangle of things that still needs to be put together. And what's been so great, especially in this year that Degrowth Institute has existed, is that we've been able to engage with people who are in the more as orthodox as degrowth can be, right? Because degrowth is already sort of in this sort of unorthodox space, but in the establishing orthodox, we've been able to engage with people who have been long involved with, say, for example, ICTA at the University of Barcelona, or here in the United States, we have who have been working for a long time at the Leadership for Ecozoic and at the University of Vermont, or at this Center for Advancing the Steady State Economy. But then these are sort of the powers and structures that exist within maybe the institutions that we already understand to be established. But then, of course, there are activists. For example, Amelia Reyes in Mexico. She has given like a great example of a different angle of approaching some of this degrowth work, where she's also been engaging with these established entities, whether they be in Europe or the United Nations. But then also her work in Mexico really focuses on the feminist angle that degrowth can really start to lean into more. And the idea of rupture that comes from feminist literature, it can be so useful in this sort of idea of delinking from a paradigm of endless economic growth and not being part of what leaders over there have called this poison pie. People don't want to be part of a growing poison pie. They want to be completely separate from it and find new ways to, quote unquote, develop, but in a way that doesn't deny justice or rights or the ability to have a good life, regardless of where you're at. So these different examples have been inspiring because there isn't one single way to engage with this process. And more so, I understand that there is frustration across the board and tension across the board at all levels, from people who are brand new to the concept and people who have been engaged for a long time. And so I know that there's an opportunity for me to, if not advocate for those who are already doing work, I think that's the bare minimum that I can do. But especially in the US, someone needs to be talking about these concepts. And while I might not have all the expertise needed to be able to share all the in-depth analysis and intricacies, I can be the person to present the concept in the first place and plant the seed necessary. So then the person who does have the expertise, again, kind of pulling these different people from different backgrounds, pulling them to do the work necessary. Like I want to be finding people who are willing to engage. And once they're engaged, well, then I hope that they know more than me, because then I need them kind of on this team so we can work to a level of power that isn't just advocacy, but now is drawing the attention of larger structures that right now sit in a position that they can ignore this. But there needs to be enough groundswell that it's no longer something that you can ignore, something that you now have to pay attention to, and then decide, do we now have to work with them, or do we have to find tactics to destroy them?
I think it's super inspiring, and it boosts me also in my advocacy here at MIT. It's great to hear. I know we're coming towards the end of our conversation, but before we wrap up, I'd like to engage in a bit of utopian thinking. We're talking about building coalition, sowing seeds of a degrowth reflection with people around us and the conversations that we have. How do you see those seeds growing in the next 5, 10 years?
There's definitely a lot of like opposing ideas in my head. Like there's so some people call me I'm optimistic, some people call me pessimistic. It just depends on where they're at. What I would say with the work that I think we've been doing here at Degrowth Institute, there's definitely a large appetite for the concepts of degrowth, and there is an eagerness from people to participate in this coalition building. And maybe the biggest struggle that people are facing is that they're ready to work, but there is no work. And the reality, especially here in the States, right? Like, so healthcare is tied to working to a job, being able to pay rent, right? Is such a looming fear and anxiety for many people. Maybe a job that you would take otherwise, you won't because it won't pay the bills. What I'm seeing is that through the work that we're doing, there is more attention to not just degrowth from this sustainability perspective. But again, that justice component does inspire people. And when it's emphasized and when it's presented honestly, not just for the sake of tacking on a word that looks pretty, but for actually going and pursuing justice, people want to collaborate with those ideas. A hope for me is that in the next 5, 10 years is that there will be money and capital available to fund more people, not just at Degrowth Institute, but across North America, to be able to work on this full time and to tap on people who might have not never heard about this concept before and get them excited. Because what's been most interesting, maybe even in the past year of going to university campuses or going to community spaces or showing up in places that have nothing to do with degrowth, is that once the conversation is started, people want to engage and they keep coming back and they keep either emailing you or showing up at a new event. Or most exciting for me is that they start their own group wherever they're at because the ideas make sense to them. They touch on a reality and they create something that I really like to say is an awkward moment, a moment of saying, oh, shoot, I knew this. Like I understood this, but for whatever reason, it just had to be put on the side. But here come these people who are just talking about it directly head on. So being able to grow just that, these moments of this oh shoot moment, is exciting for the near term. But for 10 years from now, I really would like to see these groups have moved past just creating the moments, but then now there is this infrastructure of asking for not just policy change within the systems, but to now we're talking about infrastructural shifts. We're talking about how we're collaborating across city lines, state lines, nation lines, finding where there's points of where like collective power can be built outside of what we think about traditionally. And again, this is vague thinking. These are hopes and dreams, but the work is being done. There is serious thought and strategy being done. Organizations that exist within Latin America, organizations that exist across the pond in Europe. I know that a few colleagues in China are also trying to spread this idea of degrowth more into the mainstream. So again, the ideas are spreading. What I think we'll want to maybe emphasize is avoiding the co-optation that can exist from standard sustainability or standard growth, right? Just turning this into another thing where we can sort of feel really good about an idea and then we can say I just did a degrowth thing. No, you didn't do a degrowth thing until there was an intentional downscaling of the global economy, right? Until we've achieved social justice, until ecological sustainability has been achieved. Then, yes, then degrowth, you can say we did a degrowth thing. But in the meantime, there are a lot of steps. There's a lot of networks that need to be built. There's a lot of exposure in hard, difficult moments that we'll need to face together. And maybe that's more than anything. I think in the next 10 years, I think the evidence shows that these conversations will be had. I'm excited to participate in them and go forward and then hope to seek a world that is oriented towards a downscaling of the global economy.
Generating awkward moments. For me, that's one of the main takeaways of this conversation because what I love about conversations around planetary boundaries and the implications of reckoning with those boundaries is that you can't turn away from that conversation once you've had it once. Degrowth, the difference that it has with sustainability or more generally environmental stewardship is once you know, you know. And I don't know if this resonates with you, but the way that I entered the degrowth sphere a couple of years ago really changed my perception of every choice that I had to make for myself. And this is beyond consumption. What am I going to study at university? And what work am I going to do? What are my values? that's, I think, the true strength of the degrowth conversation and the awkwardness that is embedded within it. It kind of forces a personal questioning that I think can lead in two directions that we see in people around us. It's you either get projected into eco anxiety and sense of paralysis that can be very hard to extract yourself from. But if you do have that support system and the conversations that you mentioned, and I think you're having quite frequently, it can be the source of great fulfillment. So acknowledging the power of a degrowth conversation seems like the key. Before we go, Jason, I wanted to ask you, given the breadth of topics that we've covered, from your background to your incredible high school days on your town city council, to your advocacy at Purdue, discovering degrowth, doing the work of connecting your prior influences and intellectual inspiration, especially how degrowth connects to social justice, to the future of what the Degrowth Institute's activities will look like. Do you feel like there's something that we haven't touched on that feels important to you? Something that you wish more people asked about?
Maybe just an emphasis. I want to emphasize the work that was done at Degrowth Institute in the past year. I know we focused a lot about my time before. When I came on, our big goal, our dream, the thing that we really wanted to achieve was a gathering here in the United States around degrowth. And we weren't exactly sure how that was going to happen. We knew we had a budget allocated for it, but we didn't know if it would be a curriculum that we wrote or who exactly would be presenting. But those questions got answered in action. And we just took a lot of just leaps of faith and really relied on the community that already existed around us. So right from when I joined in the fall of 2024 and through that following winter and spring and then finally summer, we organized around this idea called D School, which originally was just people gathering online, talking about what would it mean to do this thing in Chicago. Eventually, that turned into, okay, let's do it for 4 days, and let's have this community, like we will present together. So people proposed learning sessions, these action workshops, and it became very much like a democratic process of submitting ideas, and then we would sort of help edit that down and then present it back to the group, and this back and forth until finally we came down to this structure that focused on introductions to degrowth, the challenges that it faces, and then finally moving into the so what and then action. We were able to host 100 people in Chicago at the end of July. A lot of the people who came were from the original organizing groups, but then we also had a lot of people who had never heard of the groups at all, but they were interested in this idea of like, oh, degrowth, US, okay, let's do it. Gabriel, I know that you also were interested in going. I know that unfortunately you weren't able to join us ultimately. Right, a connection was still made from the fact that we put that message out there, and now we're talking here. But really, what I want to emphasize with all this is that the 4 days were amazing, and there were a lot of great conversations. I think a lot of preconceived notions about degrowth, even from people who were familiar with the term. I think everyone got challenged there. But what's been so interesting going forward is that because we took this leap to make this event happen without any real expertise in like what it means to make an event, a lot of connections that wouldn't have been made otherwise are now bearing fruit. There are groups, for example, just from Degrowth Institute, there is a policy group that's trying to organize around making degrowth policy here in the States. There's also a couple research groups that are also collaborating because it was attended by a lot of different researchers. One is kind of like a national in scope, and then there's one that's sort of like the Northeast region. But again, right, these groups didn't exist before. Now they're sort of collaborating, and then more so, there's been opportunities where people didn't know that someone was in their general geographical area, and now they're collaborating and finding new ways to sort of draw on each other's resources to be able to again talk about degrowth, challenge endless economic growth, and hopefully then also go forward and meet other people who wouldn't have heard about it otherwise. D School really gave us this opportunity to be in person and talk with people who maybe we wouldn't have engaged with otherwise. And then I think it also kind of boosted a lot of people to feel like, okay, there is a community around this. It isn't just me in this department at my university or me in this department at my job thinking about these things wildly. No, there is a network that can be tapped into, and there's hunger for doing something like that again. Will Degrowth Institute do that in the coming year? no, I don't think we have the capacity for it. But I think there is a hunger for D-School in the coming years. We will regroup, and hopefully it can be somewhere other than Chicago. That way different people can attend, and from a different capacity. And of course, in the coming years, there's a chance to maybe inject a degrowth track or a degrowth theme in other ecological societies, for example, the U.S. Society for Ecological Economics, or its equivalent in Canada called CANSI, right? All part of the larger international society. The international society already has the paired degrowth conference, but then the U.S. one is still sort of hungry for one. And then there are many other conferences that, like I was mentioning before, some of the other people who are at D-School, they're showing up and trying to build a little coalition. And again, just trying to get this more into that mainstream, get this more into the thoughts and minds and work of other people. And that's what we're most excited about, that we can continue to do the work that we do here and know that there are other people working independent of us.
That's fantastic. Great to know that those connections have been made. And yeah, you sell D-School really well, and not attending was a big frustration of mine. 2026, 2027, I'll be waiting and intrigued to interact with the rest of the degrowth community in the US. Listen, this is time, but I'd like to thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate you taking the time, and I wish you all the best going forward, and thrilled to see what you guys are coming up with at the Degrowth Institute, and can't wait to see what you release in the coming year.
Thank you so much. No, thank you for having me, and I look forward to talking again and working together going forward.
Thank you for listening to the Empty World podcast. Again, feel free to reach out online if you have any comments, thoughts, feedback, or suggestions. We've got more intriguing episodes planned for 2026. But until then, I wish you all happy holidays. Be well.